mourning the passing of Pope Francis. The Vatican announced that the Pope died. He died at 7:35 this morning, local time.
Pope Francis has died. Pope Francis leaves behind a fortune. Yes, you heard that right. The same Pope who drove a Ford Focus, lived in a guest house, and turned down a paycheck just shocked the world from beyond the grave to work at the Vatican and live there or in Rome, are believed to get salaries of about €4,000 to €5,000 a month, and when his family opened what he left behind, it brought them to tears. Jesse Waters is reporting on the sealed last will and testament that's turning heads at the Vatican and raising one massive question. How did a man who owns so little leave behind something this big? We came to the Pope's audience because we wanted to give him a certificate, making him an honorary member of our group of Sant'Egiano blood donor volunteers. Stay with us, because what's inside that envelope isn't just money, it's something far more powerful. A life of simplicity from the moment he stepped out onto that Vatican balcony in 2013. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, now Pope Francis, made one thing clear: he would not be a traditional pope. Gone were the red velvet shoes, gone was the palatial residence of the apostolic palace. He chose instead a modest room in the Dois Sancti Matthew guest house, where he'd greet visitors with warmth, humility, and a plate of simple food if you were lucky. In the eyes of many, he became a pope for the people, a man who lived as close to the ground as his title would allow. Unlike his predecessors, Francis turned down the standard papal salary. By Vatican estimates, that would have meant roughly $32,000 a month, money he publicly claimed he didn't need. He said he didn't want to be isolated by wealth, privilege, or position. In interviews, he'd shrug off questions about retirement benefits, personal security, or property. The shepherd must smell like the sheep, he once said. For over a decade, that idea guided everything he did, from his outreach to the poor to the way he moved through the Vatican without an entourage. Even his choice of transportation reflected that philosophy. Instead of using the traditional black Mercedes or papal limousines, Francis was often seen stepping into a battered Ford Focus. Pope Francis blessed a group of 35,000 Harley-Davidson bikers in St. Peter's Square. He gave away the Harley-Davidson he was gifted, sold off a luxury car for charity, and asked bishops to resist the temptation of flashy cars. For most people watching from afar, the message was loud and clear: Pope Francis had no interest in riches, not even if they were handed to him in a golden envelope. So when people discussed the Vatican's vast wealth, estimated between 10 billion and 15 billion, they rarely associated it with him personally. Those were institutional assets, not personal ones. He didn't live in a palace, he didn't dine like royalty, he refused lavish renovations and spent more time with janitors than with dignitaries. He would often be found praying in silence, sneaking out at night to visit homeless people, or spending time with those society often forgot. Public documents reflected this minimalism: no personal property, no known bank accounts, no family trust, and no indication that he planned on leaving behind any form of wealth for years. Vatican insiders would say if Pope Francis left anything behind, it's likely just a few books and a worn-out Bible. But that's where the story gets more complicated, because despite all outward signs, despite all the modesty and restraint, there were whispers, just faint ones, about how the unused salary was being handled. No one paid much attention at the time. After all, it was the Vatican. Things worked in mysterious ways, but now, in the days after his passing, people are looking back with sharper eyes. Did he really decline everything, or was there more nuance to his choices? And if he had nothing, then why did a certain envelope Leave one woman in Argentina weeping uncontrollably. Before we get to that part of the story, it's important to understand the quiet mechanics behind his daily life, because while the Pope may not have cared for riches, he did care about people, especially the ones who stood by him before the white robes and global spotlight, and some of them, it turns out, were never forgotten, even in silence. Francis may have been setting something aside, not for himself but for someone who mattered more than gold, and that changes everything. Quiet financial habits no one noticed. It's easy to assume that someone who rejects a salary simply lets the money vanish, but things at the Vatican don't work that way. When Pope Francis turned down his monthly stipend, the funds didn't just evaporate into thin air. In fact, those close to the administrative side of Vatican operations say there's a little-known mechanism in place. When a Pope declines his salary, those funds are quietly redirected, sometimes toward officially Pope Francis always refused his salary, but behind the scenes it appears the Vatican was still budgeting for it. Who work at the Vatican and live there or in Rome are believed to get salaries of about €4,000 to €5,000 a month, and according to internal sources, a portion of that amount over time was deposited into a trust under his name, not for personal use but for discretionary spending. Discretion that, by its very nature, was never announced or published. It sounds paradoxical. A man who preaches poverty yet still possesses the legal means to direct six figures a year. The path of Jesus started on the periphery. It goes towards the poor, and with the poor towards everyone else. But Francis was never about optics, he was about intent, and intent can hide a lot in plain sight. Most popes before him spent freely within their role, using stipends for travel, gifts, personal upkeep, and occasionally even retirement planning. Francis, on the other hand, funneled most of what was allocated to him into social causes, especially ones tied to Argentina, where he remained emotionally tethered. He was Pope to the world. We'd had him in Argentina for over 60 years, homes for orphans, medical care for impoverished families, scholarships for young seminarians from underfunded regions. Some of these donations were publicized, most were not. What's even more curious is that Francis never set up a personal foundation bearing his name like many modern religious leaders or public figures. He didn't build monuments to himself, but there is now evidence that he worked through intermediaries, two of them reportedly linked to Jesuit financial networks in Latin America, who helped structure and maintain a trust quietly accumulating over the years. So why the secrecy? Some insiders suggest it was his way of staying true to the vow of poverty while still acting as a provider to the public. He was the Pope who lived in a guest house, but privately he may have been managing the only form of inheritance he could justify, one built entirely for others. Still, few suspected that the money had ever been earmarked for family. Pope Francis rarely spoke about his relatives, and when he did, it was with reserved affection. He once mentioned his sister Maria Elena in passing during an interview, calling her the one person who remembers who I was before all this. That statement didn't turn heads then, it does now, because Maria Elena, living quietly in Argentina, had never accepted any benefit from her brother's position. She lived modestly even when her health began to fail. She was never spotted at Vatican events, never featured in international media, and never sought out attention. But sources now say that Francis kept in contact with her regularly and even wrote to her weekly, not just letters of love but of reassurance, perhaps to prepare her for something he knew she'd one day receive. That something, it turns out, was already growing year after year as the public marveled at the Pope's humility. The trust remained untouched. Reports say it was invested conservatively, no risky portfolios, no extravagant gains, just steady, quiet accumulation until after more than a decade it had grown into something substantial, more than just a symbolic gesture. Now, with Pope Francis gone, those quiet financial habits are beginning to surface, and they don't look like the actions of a man with no plan. They look more like a farewell gift in the making. And it would only take one envelope to unlock it. His sister, his anchor, Maria Elena Bergoglio, never saw herself as the sister of a pope. To her, Jorge was simply her older brother, the one who'd walk her to school, defend her from neighborhood bullies, and later, after their father died, fill the role of a second parent. Without ever saying it out loud, their bond was forged long before the white cassock and the papal ring, rooted in the quiet routines of Buenos Aires, in a house that echoed more with prayer than with wealth. When Jorge became Pope Francis in 2013, Maria Elena didn't fly to Rome for the inauguration. It wasn't because she didn't want to, it was because he asked her not to. According to her, he said the money it would take to travel should be spent on people in need. Pray from home. He told her that's more than enough, and she did. Every day they never lost touch, even as the demands of the papacy pulled him into global affairs through. There's a certain kind of loyalty that doesn't make headlines. Maria Elena embodied it. She never asked her brother for favors, never once tried to capitalize on his position. She even refused invitations to Vatican functions out of principle, insisting she didn't want to distract him or give the impression that she was enjoying privileges others couldn't. But Francis never forgot her sacrifices, and he certainly never forgot that she was the last living member of his immediate family. He carried that knowledge quietly, just as he carried his own burdens, and in his final years, particularly after several health scares, those close to him noticed a subtle shift. He started asking more questions about legal matters, about trusts, about how to ensure things were carried out quietly but with purpose. He never said her name publicly in these conversations, but there was no doubt who he was thinking of. And when his health sharply declined in early 2025, Vatican aides confirmed that one of his last personal requests involved sending a document to Argentina via secure courier to a woman who had never once stepped inside the apostolic palace. That woman, of course, was Maria Elena. When the sealed envelope arrived, she didn't open it right away. According to neighbors, she held it in her hands for a long time, pressing it against her chest like it was a final embrace. No one knew what was inside, not yet, but what was clear even then was that the bond between them had endured everything: the church, the fame, the distance, and even death. She wasn't just the sister of the Pope, she was the one person who never let him forget who he was before the world called him Holy Father. And now she was about to discover what he had quietly left behind. The envelope arrives. The world was still catching its breath. Pope Francis had passed, and with his death came solemn rituals, public mourning, and the quiet sealing of Vatican doors. The papal apartments were closed. The bells had tolled. Flags hung at half-mast across the world's most powerful churches. Major moment for the 1.3 billion Catholics around the world. Pope Francis has passed away, but in Argentina the mourning was quieter, personal. Maria Elena, his sister, had not flown to Rome. Her health wouldn't allow it. Instead, she stayed home, surrounded by silence, until a man in a dark suit rang her doorbell with an envelope in hand. He said nothing, only nodded and left. It looked like nothing more than a thick cream-colored document, sealed with a red wax crest. No royal fanfare, no headlines, but this envelope would soon spark one of the most unexpected twists in the legacy of the humble Pope. Music. While Maria Elena held the envelope, nearly 7,000 miles away a different kind of reveal was unfolding on American television. Jesse Waters appeared on air, seated in his studio desk with a stack of papers in front of him and that trademark smirk that always seemed to signal something big was coming. His opening line was direct: "We've got the Pope's last will and testament. And let's just say it's not what anyone expected. Pope Francis leaves behind a fortune that makes his family cry." At first, viewers assumed this would be a theological segment, maybe a final message, a quote, something spiritual, but what followed felt more like something out of a courtroom drama. Waters unfolded the document and tapped a line with emphasis. This, he said, is a legal acknowledgement of a trust fund managed for over a decade with explicit instructions for disbursement to one individual, Maria Elena. It said, "Thank you, Jesse Waters," whose reporting first brought this to light, didn't sensationalize the end. In his final coverage, he looked straight into the camera and said, "This wasn't a twist, this was the truest version of Francis. He didn't leave gold. He left dignity, and that's what made his family cry." As the world moves on, as a new conclave approaches and the Church prepares for another chapter, there's a story still quietly unfolding in Argentina, a story of a small foundation now flooded with donations, of clinics being built, shelters being expanded, and one woman who never sought attention now carrying out her brother's final wishes, quietly, faithfully, and without ceremony. In the end, Pope Francis didn't just preach humility, he planned it. He turned every unused check, every ignored benefit, into something lasting, something personal. And when he passed, it wasn't the Church that cried first, it was his sister. If a man who gave up everything still found a way to give even more in the end, what does that say about the legacy we choose to leave behind?